The auction yard was alive with the clamoring of voices, the sharp clatter of wooden gavel on its stand, and the restless stir of a sun-drenched afternoon. Dust rose from the dirt underfoot, winding around the ankles of men in heavy boots and women fanning themselves with worn shawls. It was a scene both ordinary and grotesque, a place where lives were weighed against coins and human value was measured in shillings and cents. Among the throng, a man pushed through, his eyes scanning the gathered crowd with a detached interest. He was a master, not yet wealthy but calculated, someone who looked for opportunities others would dismiss. His gaze fell upon a woman standing quietly at the edge of the auction line, and at first glance she seemed unremarkable, even laughable to those around her. She was overweight, far heavier than most of the slaves being paraded for inspection that day, and her body moved with a slow, deliberate caution that suggested either age or weakness, or so the crowd assumed. But there was something in the way she held herself that drew him in, something subtle yet undeniable. Her posture, though burdened by flesh, was straight and unyielding, as if the weight she bore had not crushed her spirit but had taught it to resist. Her eyes, large and dark, scanned the yard not with fear but with calculation, as though she were measuring every gesture, every flicker of expression, in a silent ledger of human behavior. The master felt a pang of curiosity he had not anticipated. In a world where beauty, strength, and obedience were the currencies of value, this woman, overlooked and undervalued, radiated a presence that demanded closer inspection. The auctioneer's voice rose above the murmurs, booming with theatrical authority. "And here we have, for your consideration, a strong, capable woman, ready to serve her new master." He gestured toward her, as if announcing a prize, though the words sounded hollow against the backdrop of the crowd's laughter and snickers. People whispered to one another, pointing at her generous frame, the folds of her arms, the heaviness of her legs. "Who'd want her?" one man muttered, and the sentiment spread, carried in laughter and shaking heads. To the master, however, the low estimation of the crowd only fueled his interest. Often, he had found, the most valuable things were those dismissed by the majority. The bidding began slowly. A few men called out tentative offers, trying to justify the appearance of fairness in a transaction that was anything but. The numbers were pitifully low, each bid barely nudging the coins higher, and the master watched with growing fascination. He knew the power of perception, the way it could blind people to reality. The woman before him, standing silently and composed amidst the ridicule, was a test of that very principle. Every sneer, every derisive comment only made the truth more tantalizingly hidden. Her value could not be measured in the shallow terms the world offered. Finally, when the bidding slowed to almost nothing, the auctioneer's eyes darted to the master. "Any takers at 15 cents?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. The crowd murmured, astonished at the paltry sum. 15 cents for a human life, for someone who, though overweight, clearly bore strength in more ways than one. The master stepped forward, his voice calm and deliberate. "I'll take her," he said, and the words fell like a bell in the hot, dusty air. The crowd gasped, some in amusement, some in confusion. How could a man willingly spend even 15 cents for someone the world had so easily dismissed? As the transaction was finalized, the woman was led toward him, her eyes meeting his briefly. There was no fear there, only a flicker of recognition, a spark of acknowledgement that she too understood the significance of this moment. She had been overlooked, undervalued, and yet, in that instant the balance shifted. The master paid the coins hand to hand, and felt the weight of what he had acquired, not just in flesh but in potential, in mystery. She followed him quietly, her movements careful and measured, as if she were weighing the new reality she had been thrust into. Her silence was not submission, it was strategy, a quiet assertion of the fact that her story was far from over. As they left the auction yard, the chatter of the crowd faded into the distance, replaced by the soft scrape of wagon wheels on dirt and the occasional call of a distant bird. The master observed her, studying the subtle cues in her expression, the way her eyes darted to notice small details, the way her hands flexed and relaxed as she walked. There was intelligence there, cunning perhaps, and an awareness of the world far beyond the casual gaze of any onlooker. It was a reminder that value was never truly in the surface, in the shape or weight or initial impression, but in what lay beneath, the knowledge, the resilience, the unseen connections that could shift power in ways the world might never suspect. He wondered, almost instinctively, what story had brought her here, sold for a price so absurdly low. He imagined a life of hidden hardships, of secret knowledge gleaned from long hours of observation, of strength forged in the crucible of neglect and disregard. Perhaps her former master had failed to see her worth, blinded by conventional standards, unable to recognize the quiet power she wielded simply by existing in a world that expected her to be invisible. And yet, here she was, standing at the threshold of a new chapter, her fate momentarily in his hands, her potential unclaimed, waiting to reveal itself. The sun beat down on them, the heat rising in waves from the dusty earth, but she did not complain. She adjusted the shawl draped across her shoulders, eyes fixed forward, lips pressed together in a line that suggested patience but also calculation. The master found himself captivated, not by her appearance, not by her immediate usefulness, but by the sense that she carried secrets, secrets that could change the course of his understanding, perhaps even the dynamics of power within the world he thought he knew. He could sense the tension between the visible and the hidden, the superficial judgments of society and the deeper truths that awaited discovery. It was rare, he realized, to encounter someone whose worth was invisible to the crowd yet palpable to those who took the time to see. As they approached the master's home, the rhythm of the wagon wheels on the packed earth became a kind of drumbeat, a cinematic punctuation to the unfolding story. She remained silent, observing, absorbing, as if cataloguing every detail of the new environment, the layout of the estate, the demeanor of the staff, the subtle hierarchies at play. It was impossible to read her fully, but the master did not mind. The ambiguity was part of the intrigue. The auction had been a spectacle of underestimation, a theater of ignorance where the world's shallow judgments had failed spectacularly. And now, as he led her into his home, the true performance was about to begin, one that would reveal not what the world thought it had bought, but the extraordinary potential lying hidden beneath the surface. For the master, this was not merely an acquisition, it was the first act of a story that promised revelation and surprise. Every glance, every gesture, every unspoken word from the woman was a thread in a tapestry he could not yet fully see. He felt the thrill of anticipation, the allure of mystery that had drawn him in at the auction, now magnified by proximity and observation. 15 cents had bought him more than flesh. It had bought him an enigma, a living puzzle whose solution might hold consequences far beyond the simple transaction that had brought them together. As dusk began to settle, casting long shadows across the estate, the master found himself unable to ignore the weight of possibility. The woman following him with quiet precision seemed aware of this tension as well. There was a subtle defiance in her posture, a quiet assertion that though the world had set her price at a mere fraction of her worth, she carried within her an invisible strength, an untold story that might yet reshape the understanding of those who thought themselves in control. And in that twilight hour, as the first stars pricked the evening sky, both master and acquisition seemed to recognize the delicate balance of power, curiosity, and destiny that had been established with a single astonishing purchase at an auction for 15 cents. In the silence that settled over the estate that night, broken only by the distant cries of animals and the soft rustle of leaves in the wind, the master realized that he had stumbled upon something rare. The woman he had acquired was not simply another laborer, another piece of property to be catalogued and utilized. She was a living testament to the failures of perception, a reminder that worth cannot always be measured in currency or physical appearance. 15 cents had unlocked a door to mystery, to history, and perhaps to secrets that might reverberate far beyond the confines of his own life. And in that realization, he understood that the auction yard, with all its noise and laughter, had been only the beginning, the prologue to a story far richer, far more dangerous, and far more compelling than he could have ever imagined. Before the auction, before the world had reduced her to a mere object to be bought and sold for coins, her life had unfolded in ways most people would never understand. She had not always been overlooked, not always considered a burden. In her previous home, she had known a strange mixture of harsh discipline and moments of unexpected attention, where her sharp mind and quiet wit had both intrigued and frustrated those in power. Her former owner had been a man of wealth and influence, a person who valued outward appearances and superficial obedience, more than the hidden qualities of the people around him. To him, she was a curiosity, a puzzle he could not fully grasp, and yet her very presence seemed to unsettle him in ways he could neither articulate nor ignore. From the moment she had arrived at the estate as a child, she had been different from the other slaves. While most of the children ran barefoot through the dirt paths and played in the fields, she observed, memorized, and catalogued everything she saw. Her intelligence was quiet but fierce, an ever-present force that others rarely noticed until it was too late. She learned to read the subtle shifts in her master's mood, the way his eyes narrowed when he was irritated, the faint tremor in his hand when he was anxious. She understood how to move through the house without attracting punishment, how to answer questions in ways that were truthful yet never threatening, and how to survive in a world that measured worth in obedience and labor rather than knowledge or cunning. As she grew older, her mind became a sharp instrument, honed not in formal education but in the daily necessities of survival. She memorized the layout of the estate, the hidden pathways through gardens, the storage rooms where food and valuables were kept. She listened to the conversations of her master's guests, absorbing gossip and secrets as if they were lessons in a clandestine curriculum. It was in these moments, hidden from view yet fully aware, that she began to see patterns of power, influence, and betrayal. She learned which words could soothe a volatile temper, which gestures could distract an observer, and which silences could carry the most weight. She was becoming more than a servant. She was a quiet strategist in a world that refused to recognize her value. Her former master, despite his wealth, was blind to the subtle strengths she wielded. He treated her with the casual disregard he showed to many, assuming her size and demeanor made her incapable of anything beyond the simplest tasks. He underestimated her constantly, a mistake she allowed because it served her well. While others were busy competing for his favor, she quietly gathered knowledge, storing it like precious treasure. She learned the financial habits of the household, the debts owed and hidden, the relationships strained and secret. She understood the hierarchy of power among the staff and the visitors who came and went, noting who held grudges, who could be swayed, and who would betray at the slightest provocation. It was a delicate dance, one that required patience and timing, and she had mastered it without anyone ever realizing it. Yet her life was not merely a game of observation and strategy. There were moments of real danger, moments when the cruelty of those around her threatened not just her comfort, but her very existence. Her master, a man prone to sudden anger, could lash out unpredictably. The overseers, enforcers of his will, were merciless, quick to punish perceived slights. And the world beyond the estate was no kinder, a society built on the systemic devaluation of her kind. Each day was a test of endurance, a balancing act between submission and subtle defiance. But these challenges only strengthened her. She learned resilience not as an abstract concept, but as a necessity, as the only shield between herself and ruin. Amidst the harshness, there were rare moments of connection. There were times when she was allowed to assist with tasks that required skill or intelligence, and her aptitude often drew quiet admiration from those who noticed. A letter writ, and more neatly than expected, a hidden discrepancy in accounts corrected before anyone else discovered it, an ability to calm a frightened child. These small victories became the threads of her quiet rebellion. Each demonstrated that her value was far greater than her outward appearance suggested. She began to understand that the world's measure of worth was flawed, and in that realization she found power. The true strength of her position lay in the secrets she kept and the knowledge she amassed. Despite the oppressive atmosphere, she cultivated a sharp mind and a keen understanding of human nature. She watched how fear could control men and how loyalty could be bought in ways that money could not always achieve. She learned to speak when necessary, to remain silent when essential, and to smile even when her heart recoiled. She understood the art of patience, the calculus of timing, and the subtlety of influence. She was, in every way, a force concealed beneath a body that society had chosen to dismiss. And yet, even as she mastered these skills, she remained painfully aware of the precariousness of her situation. Her value, no matter how extraordinary, was invisible to the world around her. Her potential was a secret weapon, one she carried alone, knowing that any misstep could shatter her fragile security. The relationships she formed within the estate were also lessons in strategy. Fellow slaves looked to her with suspicion or envy, sensing her intelligence, but unable to fully understand it. She navigated these dynamics carefully, offering assistance where it would cement alliances, withholding information where it would safeguard her advantage. She learned to read expressions as carefully as she read letters, understanding that the smallest flicker of doubt or fear could reveal a person's intentions more clearly than words ever could. Every interaction became a study, every glance a clue. In this way, her world became both a classroom and a battlefield, a place where survival depended on observation, cunning, and unerring attention to detail. Her past life also carried the weight of legacy and connection. Though enslaved, she had knowledge of her lineage, of family and ties that extended beyond the immediate confines of the estate. There were whispers of obligations owed, of debts unpaid, of promises made that the powerful had long forgotten. She remembered names, faces, and events with precision, holding them in the recesses of her mind like secret maps. These connections, invisible to those around her, would later become the key to understanding her worth, a hidden network that bound her past to the present in ways that could change the fates of many. Every secret remembered, every detail catalogued, became a tool she could wield when the time was right. And yet, amidst all this, she carried herself with dignity. She never allowed her treatment to diminish her sense of self, even when every other measure of value around her suggested otherwise. There was a quiet pride in her step, a subtle assertion that she existed not merely as property but as a mind, a spirit, and a repository of knowledge that the world had yet to reckon with. She had learned to navigate cruelty with grace, to turn adversity into advantage, and to transform the underestimation of others into an invisible shield. Every day, she lived in a delicate equilibrium. Balancing survival with the cultivation of power few could see, her life before the auction had been a paradox of oppression and empowerment. She was both bound and free, constrained in body but expansive in mind. Every moment of neglect or dismissal had been an opportunity to observe, to learn, to prepare for a world that might one day recognize what others could not. She understood the fragility of human perception, the folly of judging worth by surface alone, and she had made it her own. In this way, her history was not merely a tale of hardship, but a testament to resilience, intelligence, and the quiet accumulation of power that could not be bought, sold, or measured in coins. By the time the day of the auction arrived, she was ready, though she would never show it openly. She understood that the world was about to underestimate her once again, that the laughter, the whispers, and the dismissive gestures were all part of the performance the world demanded. But she was no longer a passive participant in her story. She carried the weight of her past with purpose, using every memory, every skill, and every observation as a shield and a weapon. She knew the eyes upon her would see only what they wanted, and she intended to let them, for the true revelation, the understanding of her worth, was a secret she would reveal on her own terms. And so she walked into the auction yard, her mind alive with strategy, her spirit unbroken, her body underestimated, yet her presence commanding in ways no one could articulate. She was, in every sense, a mystery wrapped in plain sight, a story unrecognized, and a force that would soon reveal itself to the one person perceptive enough to see beyond the surface. Her past, filled with lessons, observations, and hidden strength, had prepared her for this moment. And as the sun beat down, casting long shadows across the dusty yard, she knew that history was about to witness the extraordinary power of a life that had always been more than the world had assumed. The days following her purchase were quiet at first, but the silence carried a weight that neither she nor her new master could ignore. The woman moved through the estate with a measured grace, performing the tasks assigned to her with meticulous care, yet there was a watchfulness in her eyes that suggested her mind was elsewhere. The master observed her with a mix of curiosity and unease. Something about her past lingered in the way she held herself, a subtle confidence that could not be explained by mere survival instinct or intelligence alone. There was a rhythm to her movements, a precision that implied experience and knowledge far beyond what her age or station should allow. It was then, in these quiet moments, that the master began to notice hints of something unusual, a thread of connection that linked her to a world he had assumed she had left behind. At first, the signs were almost imperceptible. She would pause at the mention of certain names, her dark eyes flickering with recognition, though she said nothing. Letters, documents, and objects seemed to elicit a barely perceptible reaction, a subtle tightening of her jaw, a faint arch of her brow. The master, intrigued, began to pay closer attention. He noticed that when certain visitors came to the estate, men who carried themselves with a particular authority or spoke in hushed tones about matters of property and influence, she would watch them with the same intensity as a cat observing prey. Her awareness of their presence was immediate, her reactions almost instinctive, as if a part of her memory had been tuned specifically to recognize these people. And in the quiet hours of the evening, when the house settled into shadows and the servants retreated, she would sometimes pause near the letters left on the desk, tracing their edges with her fingers as though the words themselves contained a secret only she could decipher. The master began to suspect that she carried knowledge that extended beyond the estate, knowledge that linked her to someone powerful, someone significant in the town, and perhaps beyond. But when he asked questions, she offered only vague answers, carefully measured, revealing nothing. It became a subtle game of observation and deduction. Every action, every glance, every silence became a potential clue, and the master realized he was navigating a delicate dance in which the stakes were invisible but enormous. He could feel that beneath her ordinary, overlooked exterior lay a connection that could alter his understanding of the world he thought he controlled. One evening, while he was reviewing accounts in the dim glow of a candle, he noticed her lingering near the doorway, her posture deliberate but relaxed. "You've worked in many households before this one, haven't you?" he asked casually, attempting to provoke a response without appearing suspicious. Her eyes met his, sharp and unflinching, and for a moment he thought he saw a flicker of acknowledgement, a spark that hinted at history. She nodded slightly, and in that simple motion the master sensed the weight of untold stories pressing against the walls of her silence. There was a past, he realized, that she had not shared, a life intertwined with someone whose name carried authority and fear in equal measure. It was during one of the many chores she performed in the grand hall that the first tangible hint of her hidden connection surfaced. The master had left a letter on the table, addressed in a precise flowing script he did not recognize. She paused, her eyes tracing the signature with an intensity that made him uneasy. When he inquired, she simply said she had seen the hand before, though she refused to explain further. The master's curiosity grew into obsession. He began to piece together the fragments of information he could gather, noting patterns in her behavior, the way she reacted to certain words, the subtle attention she paid to specific individuals. Each clue was a thread, and he began to realize that if woven together, they might reveal a tapestry of relationships, debts, and secrets that had been hidden from him. As the days passed, he observed more. Guests who arrived at the estate, often under the guise of business or social calls, would be received with a deference she did not extend to others. She would anticipate their needs, offer assistance with impeccable timing, and navigate conversations in a way that suggested intimate knowledge of their habits and preferences. The master could not help but be both impressed and unsettled. Who had trained her in these skills? who had taught her to read the subtle cues of powerful men and women so accurately that she could predict their intentions almost instinctively. The answer, he sensed, lay in her past, a past she had carefully preserved, shielding it from those who might misuse or underestimate it. It was during a particularly sweltering afternoon, as the sun beat down on the estate and servants moved languidly through their tasks, that the revelation began to crystallize. The master had been reviewing an old ledger, a book filled with transactions and notes that seemed ordinary at first glance. Yet when she entered the room, she paused over a particular entry, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. He noticed her fingers twitching as if poised to trace the words, and when he inquired, she simply said, "I remember this account." The phrase, simple as it was, carried an enormous weight. Memories of debts, favors, and clandestine agreements that had long been forgotten seemed to linger in her mind, waiting for the right moment to surface. And he realized, with a mixture of awe and apprehension, that she was not merely a servant, she was a repository of knowledge, a living link to a network of influence and power that few could even imagine. The master's investigation continued, driven by a growing sense of urgency. He watched her interactions with the staff, noting subtleties in her speech and gestures. She spoke in code at times, words that seemed ordinary but carried hidden meanings. She would linger over objects, letters, or documents that held significance only to someone with intimate knowledge of a previous household, someone with ties to people of wealth and authority. The master could not shake the feeling that she had been intentionally placed, either by circumstance or design, into this world, carrying secrets that had the potential to shift Ali. Answers, alter decisions, and challenge the assumptions of those in power. And then, one evening, a visitor arrived at the estate, a man whose name and face seemed to ignite a flicker of recognition in her eyes that she could not completely suppress. The master watched with heightened awareness as she moved toward him, her steps calculated, her demeanor calm yet alert. The man greeted her with a familiarity that suggested a past connection, a bond formed in circumstances neither of them wished to speak of openly. And in that moment, the master understood the magnitude of what he had acquired. The woman he had purchased for 15 cents was not merely undervalued flesh, she was a conduit to a world of hidden ties, obligations, and knowledge that had been invisible to him until now. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the estate, the realization settled fully. The auction had been a spectacle, a performance for a crowd that could not recognize her worth. But beyond the gaze of the spectators, beyond the shallow judgments of those who had laughed at her size and appearance, she carried a legacy, a hidden connection to people who had influence, wealth, and power. The master felt both excitement and apprehension. He had stumbled upon something extraordinary, something that could alter the course of his life and the lives of others. And yet, he knew that understanding it would require patience, observation, and perhaps a trust in her that he had not yet earned. Over the following days he watched more closely. She moved through the house with the same quiet authority she had always carried, observing, cataloguing, and remembering. Small actions revered her knowledge, the way she handled documents, the precise timing of her chores, the subtle influence she exerted over conversations. He began to suspect that her previous master, the one who had sold her for such a trivial sum, had failed to recognize the true extent of her abilities and connections, and he realized that this failure, this underestimation, had created an opportunity for him, a chance to uncover secrets that might otherwise have remained hidden indefinitely. One evening, he found himself alone with her in the dimly lit hall, the air thick with the scent of wood, dust, and candle smoke. He could no longer ignore the growing sense of destiny, the feeling that she was not merely a passive participant in the world around her, but an active agent in a web of influence that had already begun to take shape. "Tell me about your past," he said quietly, testing the waters. She met his gaze with a calm intensity, the kind that suggested she weighed every word before speaking. She said nothing, yet in her silence he sensed volumes. He understood that the connection she carried was not something she would reveal lightly. It was a treasure, a weapon, and a shield all at once. And so the days turned into weeks. The master continued to observe, piecing together fragments of her history, following subtle cues, and learning to recognize the invisible threads that linked her to powerful figures and hidden agreements. Every gesture, every pause, every measured word revealed a new layer, and he began to see the intricate web of influence she navigated with effortless skill. It was as if her life had been training for this very moment, preparing her to move through a world of power, secrecy, and perception with unmatched precision. In the quiet moments of reflection, he realized that the auction had been a beginning, not an end. The woman he had bought for 15 cents was far more than the sum of her parts. She was a living testament to hidden strength, unseen connections, and untapped potential. The hidden connection to her former owner was not merely a link to the past, but a doorway to understanding the dynamics of power, influence, and survival in a world that valued appearances over substance. And in that understanding, he knew that the story they were now entangled in was only beginning. A story of secrets, revelations, and a profound realization that value is often invisible to those who are too blind to see it. The days turned into weeks, and what had begun as a quiet curiosity now consumed the master's thoughts entirely. The woman he had purchased for 15 cents, whose body had been underestimated by the auction crowd, had begun to reveal subtle hints of a hidden life he could no longer ignore. Every movement she made, every glance she cast, seemed to carry the weight of unspoken knowledge. The master had learned to watch her with a careful eye, noting the patterns in her behavior, the fleeting reactions to names, documents, or visitors, and the almost imperceptible expressions that passed over her face like shadows. What had once been a faint suspicion that she was connected to someone powerful had grown into a compelling certainty. She was a key to a mystery that few could have imagined. It began with small things, almost mundane in their appearance, but extraordinary in their implications. Letters would go missing from the desk for hours, only to reappear, neatly folded and tucked away, as if she had read them, absorbed their contents, and decided what needed to remain hidden. Certain visitors would arrive, and she would greet them with a confidence that seemed unnatural for someone in her station, yet somehow entirely appropriate. She would anticipate questions, offer information in subtle ways, and yet never speak more than necessary. The master, both fascinated and unsettled, realized that her life had been built on understanding the intricate threads of human behavior and social hierarchy. She did not merely survive, she observed, calculated, and directed without anyone noticing. One evening, a candle flickered against the walls of the master's study as he pored over old account books, letters, and legal documents. He had begun to trace patterns, seeking connections between the woman's reactions and the world around her. At first it was frustrating. She gave nothing away willingly. But then subtle signs emerged. A hesitation when a particular name was mentioned, a tightening of her lips when a certain letter was laid on the table, a careful arrangement of papers that seemed innocuous, but which, when studied closely, suggested a deep understanding of the people involved and the obligations that tied them together. The master felt as though he was piecing together a puzzle, but the edges were blurry, and some pieces refused to fit. And yet, he could sense the magnitude of what was hidden behind her calm exterior. Her knowledge was not limited to mere facts. It extended to strategy, influence, and control. She seemed to know when to act, when to remain silent, and when to redirect attention, all without appearing to intervene. The master noticed that she influenced conversations subtly, a remark here, a gesture there, and suddenly the course of a discussion would shift in a way that benefited those she deemed worthy. There was precision in her actions, a hidden choreography that suggested careful planning and foresight. It became clear to him that her skills were not learned in the mere course of household duties. They had been honed through experience, through observation of power, and through a keen understanding of human nature. Then came the moment that changed everything. A visitor arrived unexpectedly, a man of considerable influence whose presence caused the woman's demeanor to shift in ways the master had not seen before. She greeted him with a quiet respect, yet there was a familiarity in her posture, a recognition. That suggested more than mere acquaintance. The master watched intently, noticing how her words and gestures seemed to carry layers of meaning, how she navigated the conversation with a subtle mastery that few could achieve. The man spoke of past debts, old favors and obligations owed, and her eyes flickered with knowledge he could not yet access. He realized that she was not merely a servant who had been overlooked, she was a repository of secrets, a guardian of relationships, and a key to understanding networks of influence that extended far beyond the estate. Over the next several days, the master began to probe more intentionally. He asked questions that seemed casual but were designed to gauge her reaction. He observed her movements, the way she arranged her surroundings, and the subtle interactions she had with visitors and staff alike. And, in each observation, he saw patterns emerging, threads that connected her past to powerful individuals, to hidden alliances and to debts that had remained unpaid for years. It was as if her life had been carefully orchestrated to place her in a position where she could see, know, and influence without being noticed. The master understood that he was witnessing not only intelligence but also a mastery of social navigation and secrecy that few possessed. There were nights when he would catch her staring into the distance, as if recalling events that had occurred long ago, events that shaped her understanding of the people around her. Her gaze seemed to pierce through the present, reaching into a past filled with hidden interactions, obligations, and alliances. The master began to realize that her connection to her former owner was not a simple familial or transactional tie. It was a network of influence, carefully maintained and preserved. The woman had been entrusted with knowledge that could alter the balance of power, and she carried it silently, wielding it only when necessary, with precision and discretion. One afternoon, while reviewing estate records with her, the master noticed a series of annotations she had made in the margins of an old ledger. The notes were subtle, almost invisible to an untrained eye, but they revealed an understanding of financial and social obligations that far surpassed what he had imagined. She had traced the movement of debts, gifts, and favors over time, identifying connections and dependencies that others would have overlooked. The master felt a shiver of realization. This was the kind of knowledge that could reshape fortunes, influence decisions, and expose secrets long thought buried. He understood that the seemingly trivial act of purchasing her for 15 cents had given him access to a mind capable of unraveling intricate webs of power. The woman herself was aware of the master's growing curiosity. She did not flee from it, nor did she feign ignorance. Instead, she maintained a careful equilibrium, revealing only what she wished, leaving gaps that encouraged speculation but prevented exposure. Her control over information was meticulous, and the master found himself both challenged and captivated by her skill. Every conversation, every gesture, every act of obedience was layered with meaning, and he began to recognize that the mystery surrounding her was not an obstacle but a guide, leading him toward truths he might never have uncovered on his own. One evening, as the house settled into shadows, the master discovered an old, folded letter tucked behind a stack of papers in the library. The handwriting was familiar, though faded with age, and the contents suggested a connection he had not yet fully understood. The woman's eyes, when he showed it to her, betrayed nothing overtly, yet he sensed an acknowledgement, a silent admission that she recognized the significance of the letter. The pieces began to align: her past, the network of individuals she had known, the debts and obligations she understood, all converged into a coherent picture. She was a bridge to the hidden, an interpreter of unspoken contracts, and a guardian of truths that few dared to confront. As the master delved deeper, he realized that her influence extended beyond the walls of the estate. The woman had lived a life observing, learning, and connecting, quietly threading herself into a web that spanned the town, its wealthy families, and even those who operated in shadows. She understood leverage, the value of timing, and the subtle shifts that could turn fortune or misfortune. He began to see her actions not as mere compliance, but as strategic interventions, choices made with foresight and intention. The world had judged her by her appearance, by the size of her body and the superficial assumptions of others. But the truth was far more complex. She was a master of influence, invisible yet formidable. Over time, the master began to trust her implicitly, though not without caution. He recognized that she could guide him, teach him, and even protect him from dangers he did not yet understand. She revealed information in measured doses, allowing him to piece together her past, her connections, and the depth of her knowledge. Each revelation was a turning point, a moment of awe and apprehension as he realized the breadth of her hidden power. The more he learned, the more he understood that her value could never have been measured in currency, and that the auction had been a spectacle of profound misunderstanding. Her life before the auction, once obscured and dismissed, now emerged as a map of strategy, intelligence, and hidden influence. The connections she maintained with her former owner and others of power were not relics of the past, but living instruments, tools she wielded with precision. The master found himself increasingly dependent on her insight, her ability to navigate social and financial networks, and her understanding of human nature. She was not simply a servant, she was a force of intellect and foresight, a guide through the intricate labyrinth of relationships and obligations that defined the world around them. The unraveling of the mystery was gradual, almost imperceptible at first, but then it gained momentum. Visitors, letters, and documents all played their part, revealing fragments of a life previously hidden. The master learned that she had been positioned by circumstance and design to witness, record, and understand secrets that could alter the balance of power. Her knowledge was a living archive, and she wielded it carefully, knowing when to reveal and when to withhold. By the time the full picture began to emerge, he realized that she had never truly been powerless. The world had only failed to recognize the force she embodied. By the end of this chapter of their lives, the master understood the truth. The woman he had purchased for 15 cents was extraordinary in every sense. She was a keeper of secrets, a strategist, and a bridge between past and present. The unraveling of her mystery had revealed not only her hidden connections, but also the profound limitations of perception, the danger of underestimation, and the power that could reside within those whom the world had deemed insignificant. The estate, once a simple home of work and routine, had become a stage for the revelation of intelligence, influence, and subtle authority. And in the shadows, the woman moved with quiet command, guiding, teaching, and revealing just enough to show that her story was far richer than anyone could have imagined. The air in the estate had grown heavier with anticipation, as though the very walls knew that a revelation was imminent. The woman, whose presence had once been dismissed and ridiculed, moved with a quiet purpose, each step measured, each glance deliberate. The master watched her intently, having spent weeks tracing the threads of her past, observing her interactions, and uncovering the subtle ways in which she exerted influence. He had learned to recognize the hidden depth in her silences, the coded gestures that spoke volumes, and the connections she maintained with people of power, some known, others whispered about in private conversations he could barely understand. He had expected insight, cleverness, and perhaps a touch of strategy. But what he was about to uncover went far beyond anything he had imagined. It began with a letter, old and yellowed, discovered tucked away behind a false panel, in the desk where she often worked. The edges were brittle, the ink faded, yet the contents were explosive. The woman's former owner, a man whose reputation had long shielded him from scrutiny, had written in meticulous detail about debts owed, favors demanded, and agreements made in secrecy. The handwriting, though neat, carried a weight that suggested urgency and fear. When the master showed the letter to her, she studied it carefully, her expression calm yet intensely focused. For a brief moment, a flicker of emotion crossed her face, something that resembled recognition, perhaps even satisfaction. but it passed almost immediately. She had seen it before, understood it, and knew exactly how to act on it. The master leaned in, trying to grasp the significance of what lay before him. This connects you to him," he said cautiously, his voice betraying a mixture of awe and disbelief. She nodded once, ever so slightly, her lips pressed into a line that suggested a story far deeper than the words on the page. He realized that her connection to her former owner was not a simple matter of family or circumstance. It was a network of influence, obligation, and secrets that could alter the fortunes of men who had long believed themselves untouchable. She had been the keeper of this knowledge, and her silence had been as powerful as the letter itself. Over the following days, the master began to piece together the full extent of her influence. Visitors arrived, some by appointment, some by chance, and each interaction revealed another layer of her hidden power. She knew which conversations to intercept, which documents to draw his attention to, and which favors had been promised, forgotten, or betrayed. It was as though she had been a silent architect of events long before he had ever set eyes on her. The revelation was dizzying. Everything about the woman he had purchased for 15 cents, the size the crowd had mocked, the slow gait, the quiet demeanor, was now recast in a different light. She was not merely a survivor, she was a strategist, a guardian of knowledge, and a key player in a network of human affairs that spanned beyond his imagination. The estate itself seemed to respond to this growing awareness. Rooms he had passed daily suddenly felt alive with possibility. Corridors carried echoes of decisions long made, and the subtle dynamics between staff and visitors began to reveal patterns he had never noticed. The woman navigated these spaces with uncanny precision, guiding him without ever seeming to lead. She suggested courses of action through questions rather than statements, nudged him toward discoveries without revealing her full hand, and left him marveling at the way she could influence outcomes simply through careful observation and timing. He began to understand that her knowledge and influence were far more valuable than any labor or service she could provide in the traditional sense. Then, one afternoon, a confrontation occurred that would crystallize the scope of her hidden connection. A man arrived at the estate, one whose reputation as a shrewd and ruthless businessman preceded him. He carried himself with authority, his eyes scanning the estate as if measuring power, influence, and wealth. The woman greeted him with calm familiarity, guiding him to a chair, offering refreshment, and speaking in a measured tone that conveyed respect without subservience. The master observed, stunned, as the man responded with deference he had never expected. It became clear that the woman's influence reached even those who had long wielded power without question. She knew their secrets, their debts, and their vulnerabilities, and she had the confidence to wield this knowledge without fear. As the interaction unfolded, the master realized that the auction, the laughter, and the ridicule had obscured the truth. She had always been more than the world allowed her to appear. The 15-cent purchase was not a measure of her worth. It was a miscalculation by society, a failure to see the extraordinary power that resided within her. And now, as he watched her navigate a conversation that could determine fortunes and reputations, he understood that he had acquired not just a servant but a guide, a protector, and a force capable of shaping events in ways he had never imagined. The woman herself remained calm throughout the unfolding drama. Her knowledge of her former owner, the debts owed, and the hidden obligations she maintained allowed her to steer events with subtlety. She revealed just enough to ensure that justice, or at least what she deemed appropriate, was observed, yet withheld the full extent of her power until the precise moment when it would have maximum impact. It was a lesson in patience, timing, and strategy, and the master could not help but be both impressed and humbled by her mastery. She was teaching him silently that influence did not always come from force or visibility, but from understanding, observation, and the careful manipulation of knowledge. One evening, as shadows lengthened across the estate and the last light of day faded into dusk, the master finally understood the full magnitude of what he had purchased. The woman he had once dismissed as a figure of ridicule was connected to powerful individuals in ways that could alter fortunes, decisions, and lives. Her former owner had trusted her with information that could have toppled reputations, influenced property disputes, and shifted alliances, and she had carried this knowledge with discretion, using it only when necessary, always aware of the delicate balance between revelation and concealment. He realized that her life had been a careful negotiation of survival, intelligence, and influence, and that the auction had been the final act in a long performance designed to place her in a position of power, though the world had been too blind to see it. Over the next few days, the master witnessed the unfolding of her strategy in greater detail. Letters were delivered and redirected, favors were called in with subtle reminders, and debts long ignored were acknowledged through quiet intervention. She moved through the estate like a conductor, orchestrating events with precision, guiding conversations and influencing outcomes without ever appearing to exert control. The master saw the impossible. She was everywhere and nowhere at once, shaping events in ways that others could not perceive, yet which would have profound consequences for anyone who underestimated her. The unexpected twist came fully into focus during a dinner with influential figures from the town. They had come to discuss business and property, yet their attention was subtly diverted by the woman's calm presence and insightful interjections. She asked questions that revealed knowledge of prior arrangements, uncovered inconsistencies in claims, and guided the discussion toward resolutions that no one else had considered. The master watched in awe as her quiet command altered the course of decisions, demonstrating that the woman who had once seemed invisible now wielded authority greater than any person in the room. It was a revelation of both skill and foresight, a dramatic inversion of expectations that left the master both exhilarated and profoundly aware of his own misjudgments. In the following weeks, the full scope of her hidden connection became impossible to ignore. She maintained communication with figures from her past, guided negotiations, and leveraged her understanding of obligations and favors to influence outcomes beyond the estate. The master realized that she had always been extraordinary. The world had simply refused to recognize it. Her past, carefully preserved and meticulously observed, had prepared her for this moment of quiet triumph. She had survived, she had learned, and she had mastered the delicate art of influence in a society designed to underestimate her. And then came the final revelation. The former owner, whose influence had once seemed absolute, had left a legacy in her hands. Debts, secrets, and obligations he thought buried were now under her guidance. She could choose to expose them, manipulate them, or preserve them for strategic advantage. The master, once the observer, now understood that he was part of her story, not the other way around. The 15-cent purchase had unlocked access to intelligence, strategy, and influence that could not have been bought in any market. The world had laughed at her, discounted her, and dismissed her as insignificant. But in truth, she had always been in command. In the quiet of the evening, as the stars emerged in the sky, the master reflected on the journey he had witnessed. He understood finally that appearances were deceiving, that value was often hidden in plain sight, and that power did not always reside in wealth or status. The woman he had purchased had turned the expectations of the world on their head, revealing a reality far more complex, subtle, and extraordinary than anyone could have anticipated. Her connection to her former owner, once obscured by the passage of time and the ignorance of others, had become a force that shaped the present, altered decisions, and commanded respect. And in that understanding he realized the truth: she had never been powerless. The auction, the ridicule, the shallow judgments, all had been a stage upon which her brilliance had been hidden, waiting for the right observer to recognize it. And now, as the night deepened and the estate settled into silence, he knew that the story they shared was far from over. It was a story of secrets revealed, power asserted, and expectations overturned, a testament to the extraordinary strength of a woman who had been undervalued, underestimated, and yet had always been extraordinary beyond measure.